I started out by making a mold using a lightweight twill fiberglass fabric off of an old Caddy tailgate. Here you can see the results. This is a positive mold, so it takes a lot of patience to get the letters coming out nicely. There's better ways to do it, but this is how I did it this time. Next, I marked that mold out as square, parallel, and to the correct size as I could, and trimmed it. So I cut off all the excess material, and the resulting edge is going to end up being exactly the size I want it to fit on the tailgate. In case I forget to mention it later on, this is just a technique, and I've already decided that this is going backwards, that you'd come out with a better end result with less work if you made a negative mold instead of a positive mold. So in the next one, I'm actually going to try another technique where I make the mold much like this mold that I'm using, but then make another casting off the inside of it. That way the letters will be smoother on the outside. Then using my mold, I laid it on the tailgate and marked it out exactly where I wanted it to fit. And I used a scribe, a knife, to go all the way through the gel coat, because the first step I'm going to do is sand off the gel coat, making sure it's centered and it's parallel, so I've got a good spot there. Next step was to sand. Obviously I wanted to get off all the gel coat, and I wanted to make a cavity in the tailgate that was the same depth as the thickness of my mold, so it would come out as close to level as I could. In the video here I'm using a palm sander. I actually got frustrated with that being too slow after a while and used a couple of other sanders. But you want to keep it flat, smooth, and get that depth just right. So it's a little bit painstaking, but in the end you end up with a nice looking product. So here you can see the kind of groove, the little bit of a cavity that I've cut into the tailgate. Made sure it went all the way through the gel coat, because when I fiberglass to it, I want it fiberglass to fiberglass for good adhesion. And then I trial fit the mold in there after I remember where I put it. Oh, there it is. I laid it over here. And now I'm checking the depth to make sure that I can sand it smooth once I fiberglass this in. So it's pretty close. It looks pretty good. There's a little more curve to the tailgate than to my mold, but I can make up for that when I'm fiberglassing. So after cleaning everything up real good, really well, I mixed up a batch of caviezel, and that takes a little bit of time. And then I mixed up another batch of just straight resin. So I had both batches ready to go. The caviezel, I make it to call it a peanut butter consistency, and I'll show you here in a second what we want to do with that. So after mixing, I've got my peanut butter consistency of well mixed caviezel. Make sure it's mixed well and you don't have voids and dry spots in there. Put your caviezel away before you knock it over and make a mess. Then I mixed up a batch of just straight resin and mixed that real well, so I had it all ready, had both materials set to go, so I could just start brushing it in. So I take the standard, the straight resin, get it well mixed here, and I'm going to use that as wet out, and then I'm going to fill the letters with the caviezel. So in the video here, you can see I started filling with the caviezel, but then I decided, it would probably be better if I wet it out, and that would help fill all the little tiny cavities in the twill fabric. So I switched back over. So I'd recommend that you wet it out with straight resin first. It won't hurt to have a little layer of resin in there. And then go back, and I used a spatula blade to fill and then smooth with the caviezel. So you want this to come out that the letters are completely full to give them some support. So when someone leans on the tailgate, they don't dent the letter in. But you want to make sure they're full, but you don't want to have any excess, because as you put this onto the tailgate, you'll see later on here in a little bit, I'm rolling out all the excess that I can so that it lays nice and tight and smooth flat against that tailgate. The next step was to take the straight resin and wet out the tailgate itself. Again, I'm just just spreading a smooth layer, filling all the little sanding cavities, and that way I'll get good adhesion when I actually put this mold up on the tailgate. So I get a good wet out. The resin, the straight resin, is fairly easy to squeegee out when you get to the next stage here, before it cures, obviously. So it's not too critical that if you get too much in there, but if you have a huge excess, it makes a mess everywhere else. And if you leave a run down the rest of the tailgate, then you'll have to sand that off later when it cures. Then I'm laying the mold in. Make sure I'm getting it centered. Make sure you get your line up, because you're not going to change this once it cures. And then I use both a brush and a mini roller to press out all the excess that I could and make sure I had the flat backside of the mold down tight. So I use the brush and I'm poking out all the air bubbles that I can, trying to get rid of any voids, making sure there's resin in between the two surfaces. There's a little bit of resin layer that I'm putting on top of the letters, but the more that you put on there, the more you're going to have to sand off too. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here. It's nice if you can let it self-level a little bit and you get a nice smooth surface, and it prevents you from sanding into the letters themselves when you start sanding, but you're going to end up doing this stage again. So then here I'm with the mini roller and I'm working out the excess caviezel out of the in between the mold and the tailgate. And again, it's just a little bit of patience, and you just keep working it. And the neater you can be, the less cleanup and the less sanding you'll have later. You're going to have a whole lot of sanding anyway that you cut it, but anything you can do to decrease that by staying neat here will help. I didn't get it filmed, so it's not in the video here, but when I was complete with this stage, I went back with the knife blade and smoothed that edge to get all the excess off of basically the crack, and to make the minimum amount of void to fill later on. So here's a look at the tailgate after it's cured, and you can see I've already started sanding. There's going to be several steps, and I'm starting off here with some 80 grit, and I made little blocks out of pieces of paint stick so I can sand in between the letters. The next step was several layers of automotive body filler and high build primer, sanding in between each, and then primering again with like a guide coat, sanding it all down until you get it to where it's acceptable. I didn't plan on making an instructional video on this, so I didn't film every step. But if you look closely in this picture, you can see 3 white spots there on the top side of VOL. That's little bits of body filler. So I'm getting close to the end here, between primer and filler. It's a time-consuming process and a lot of sanding, keeping those letters neat and straight. When you get the high gloss on it, it will show every error that you made. But I'm pretty happy the way this came out. The end result is pretty spectacular. I can't complain, but I won't make the next one this same way.